Thank you for coming out, everybody. My name is Dan. So I'm a student here in cognitive science at the University of Toronto. I like to study, psychedelics as sort of a grounding point for a lot of other interests that I have, namely mystical experiences, cognitive optimization, how do you make your brains work as efficiently as possible, and how do you enhance emotional well-being. All of those sorts of questions. So of course, psychedelics seem to be a powerful tool in being able to do that, and though of course they are a tool best integrated with a number of other cognitive and psychological tools. A term often used is psychotechnologies, which are basically different ways of operating and interfacing with your mind in order to make it function in different ways. And so some examples of that are familiar are like mindfulness and meditation. There's also a number of visualization practices and so on, which I'm particularly interested in because the visual cortex is a massive part of your brain, and mental imagery and so on. It makes use of the sort of neural underpinnings involved in perception and so on, and you can reuse that in experiences of prophetic vision, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So I call this sort of transpersonal neurophenomenology, which is to say that transpersonal psychology is the study of states that we normally consider outside of or beyond typical, ordinary, normal consciousness. So mystical experiences definitely fall under that, experiences of like oneness and otherwise abstract or undescribable experiences in daily life that happen perhaps more than you admit. And so neurophenomenology is the approach of integrating self-reports of your experience with what's going on in the brain as we are measuring it. So trying to integrate a little bit of that. And thus we get this talk, which is entitled The Neurobiology of Prophetic Visions, Dreams, Drugs, and the Predictive Brain. So I'm going to give you all a crash course in predictive processing, which is a model for cognition that has becoming prominent in the cognitive sciences, and we'll talk about how that relates to the psychedelic experiences, especially those wherein you are getting sort of visionary experience and hallucinatory material that'll require an account of what precisely hallucinations might be and how they are generated. So the argument, in a nutshell, that I'm trying to make here is that the function of experience, or what might otherwise be called phenomenal consciousness, is to coordinate both the neural substrate involved in generating it and the organism as a whole. Now, that's to say, this is opposed to views which consider your conscious experience to be epiphenomenal, that is layered over top of your biological, physical stuff, but not really causally influencing it at all. It's strange to me, honestly, that that's a view. Secondly, whether or not experience is real doesn't matter, just the fact of having experiences themselves have that effect. And altered states of consciousness, such as those in visionary mystical experience, and related practices like lucid dreaming, can adaptively exploit that causally true experience. So we know that things are happening to the brain, we know that they have a causal effect on your cognition and processing, and so we can appropriate those meaningfully and willfully to engage with our experience in a willful and directed manner. So why is any of that important, you might ask? Well, it's pretty cool. It renders the imagination and a wider scope of the human experience intelligible to scientific inquiry. The imagination is not something that's beyond our reaches or anything like that. In fact, it's fairly easy to talk about it in a scientific way. There's ongoing research into mystical experiences, especially with the psychedelic research renaissance that's ongoing. However, there are some unfortunate problems in that we can't differentiate between categories of mystical experience within our testing methods. Now, there was a question in Gonzo's talk this morning about, well, how do we define mystical experiences? And I'm going to talk about why how we're defining them in the psychological literature is inadequate. And that is precisely because different categories of mystical experiences may have different mechanisms and therefore different effects. So we want them for different things. So let's start with an account of perception and hallucination. So there are two dominant categories in this field of research. The first one is called the common kind account, which is to say that perception and hallucination are the same sorts of things. So you have a causal chain of processing from when you're eyes retrieve the information all the way up until when they generate your experiences. And if you stimulate that at any point in that process, then it is identical, whether or not it's coming from something generated within your mind or whether it's generated from something in the world. Now, there is a second account called the disjunctivist account, which is to say that perception and hallucination are not the same sort of thing, precisely because they are missing the lack of causal connectedness to things in the world. Now, a lot of disjunctivist accounts try to explain away hallucinations. And just to make it more clear, it's a disjunctivist because there is a disjunction between what is a perception and what is a hallucination. Your experience is not what is the world, and so this leads us into representationalist accounts where what you are experiencing is a rendering or a representation of what's in the world, but not necessarily exactly what is the world. And so there's this view that in hallucinations, you're not actually having them. You might be having some sort of metacognitive error. It's states that you would require, in order to have some phenomenal representational content, that there be something stimulating your senses, and that if you think that you're seeing something, that you're just reflecting on your experience and sort of falsely tagging the idea of something or the concept of something as being perception, rather than actually seeing it, because you have all sorts of metacognitive processes that give you an account of how your processing is doing and what you're seeing. One of them is called reality testing, which is important when we're talking about psychedelic experiences and so on. So it might say that your reality testing is incorrect and that things that are coming in your imagination which aren't perceptual are being tagged as perceptual and real when in fact they are not. Oh, and if anybody has any questions throughout this, I'd like to keep the floor fairly open for that, so if you need clarification or anything, just let me know. Yes?
Speaking of like our senses and stuff, aren't our senses like not, like through evolution and stuff, we can't see everything, so when you say like everything has to be stimulated from the outside, well, we're not really perceiving everything the way it is. That's why this is a cognitive tool to increase that.
Yes.
What do they think about?
Well, I'm going to go into all of that. Yeah, so the question was basically, because of the evolutionary psychology that we have, we see some things and not others. And a quick answer to that is, while we don't see everything, we don't see nothing true, and that we are still seeing true aspects of objects. And that is my own take, not necessarily related to that, but how I would respond to that. Okay, so predictive processing, what is that? So the main books that I'm going to be citing from, I like to keep things concise and condensed so you can go explore these sources, are After Phrenology by Michael Anderson, that came out in 2014, great read, and Surfing Uncertainty by Andy Clark. So those are pretty good summaries of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about and what I will be summarizing. So in the predictive processing account, perception itself is not a passive feed-forward affair, but is extensively modulated by top-down feedback connections from downstream neural assemblies that bias the response to subsequent sensory intake. Okay, so there's a lot in there. I will unpack that as we go. But basically what's happening is that perception is not just taking in information and then building things in a direction that is sort of bottom-up, and it's not all top-down, expectation-built representations. So you have two streams of information. One of them is coming up in from your senses, and then you have at the high level of your cortex, I'll talk about the mechanisms of that specifically, you have sort of expectation states and association states that then send another stream of information down into the same neural streams that are sending information up your brain, and that is modulating the information. And so perception is a mutual process of coordination between bottom-up incoming information and your top-down expectation-driven states and so on. So what this means is that predictive processing offers a package deal in which perception, understanding, dreaming, memory, and imagination may all emerge as variant expressions of the same underlying mechanistic ploy that meets incoming sensory data with matching top-down predictions. This entails the capacity to use downward connections to self-generate perception-like states. which is otherwise to say that your brain is a virtual reality generator. Which, if you've had a dream at any point in your life, you've seen this happen. Okay, so one of the worries with perception and stuff is that you sort of have a causal block between what is in the world and what you're experiencing. And some people think that all that you are observing is representations of things in your head, and that perception is all just happening in your brain. And this might seem to indicate that, seeing as it does necessarily entail that we do sort of generate some rendering, we sort of filter out some aspects of information and select others, and then sort of build internally an experience of what's happening. But Clark says that rather than spawning some kind of virtual reality rudely interposed between the mind and the world, the well-functioning perceptual system disperses the fog of surface statistics and partial information to reveal a world of salient, meaningful patterns shaped by human needs and possibilities. So, predictive processing is happening on probabilistic mechanisms. Bayesian statistics is predominantly what we are using to model how that's happening. I'll give you an account of that in a moment. But yeah, you're not just constructing a representation and sort of superimposing it onto a world that may be something entirely different than what we're seeing. No, you are linked to the world, and what you are seeing is basically you're extracting some features which are causally connected to the actual objects of perception themselves. And so with this view, we also get what's called like embodied cognition, and I also like the extended mind theory a lot, which goes to say that your experience in your mind is not restricted to your skull and skin, but rather that it sort of causally extends out into your environment. And so we have to sort of make sense of brain-environment interactions, not just your brain and not just the environment, and we're making sense of perception and experience. Any questions about that? Yep, cool. So, like I mentioned, predictive processing uses Bayesian probability theory to formulate perception as a constructive process based on internal or generative models. In this view, the brain is an inference machine that actively predicts and explains its sensations. So that top-down feed-forward stream that you're getting is basically predictions on what the neurons going up the stream are going to be doing next. So, as we model that within neuroscience and computational stuff, that's using Bayes' principles of probability. So that's what the general equation looks like. It gets more complicated, but this is like the basic Bayesian theorem. So what it means is that the probability of A given B is equal to the probability of B given A, and the independent probability of A over the independent probability of B. And so when we're talking about perception, you just plug in your neurons into that equation, and that's what you get. So as we'll talk about, there are, perception is hierarchical, and so it goes up a series of layers, and each layer is predicting the activity of the one below it upon itself. And so if we're talking about, say, layer 5 and 6 in this, then we would plug for A the layer 6 neurons, and for B we would plug in the layer 5 neurons, and we would sort of get an account of how those are coordinating their activity to each other. And of course that happens, there are 6 layers in the cortex, and it would happen along all of those levels. So here's what a model of that looks like. I won't go into this too much, but I'll explain the basics of what this means. So what you're actually seeing, your perception is actually being updated based on prediction error rather than on what is, which is pretty cool because rather than constructing representations via what is in the environment, you're actually shifting your perception based on what is not what you're expecting. And that happens precisely by modulating the substrate, propagating the signal directly, or by action if the error is prominent enough. So, for example, if, so let's say I'm like looking at my hand, right? So I'm representing my hand in a particular place, and I am looking at it, and then if I move my hand, well then my neurons are picking up that it's not in that place, and as I'm moving it, it's sort of picking up the error of where it was relative to where it is now, and then updating it relative to the error such that the error gets explained away. And an interesting example of how that works in action, you could say, for example, if there is a case of like obsessive compulsive disorder where you really need everything to be ordered in like straight lines and everything needs to be like perfectly arranged, then you're getting like a high amount of negative affect coming from disorder, say, and that would require, it's not something that you can modulate just by changing your neurons, because you can't really generate hallucinations that easily, otherwise all of reality would just be a mess. So you have to actually rearrange things in your action such that they fit into your expectations of how they should be. And yeah, so this is like coming in from the world. Let's say these are your eyes on this end, and then the signal is propagating up this way, with your predictions coming back down this way. So pyramidal neurons are what encode predictions. They are, I'll show you a slide about that next, but they basically are the primary form of neuron in your higher neocortex, and they span 6 layers from the subcortical areas. Some of your subcortical areas project into it so that they can sort of interact, and then they cap off at the top of your brain around here. And so we have, so your predictions, they're also plastic, which is interesting. So you sort of like learn ways of seeing. Babies, when they're growing up, they like to look at corners a lot, and one of the reasons that that is expected to be the case is because a lot of your lower level visual cortex is oriented towards just responding to straight lines and so on. And so those areas are getting lots of information so that they can learn precisely how to respond quickly to those basic features of the environment. And so the error units thereby, they inhibit the neurons that propagate prediction error. So if prediction error is only within sort of a minimal amount, they will be explained away, which is to say that the downstream of information will sort of quash it out or just override the signal, basically, with the downcoming signal. But if the signal reaches a particular threshold, then the error units will signal the pyramidal neurons to actually change the prediction and thereby change your experience. And this is, I should make clear, a model and not equal to what is in your brain, but that's basically how it happens. You have this interaction between prediction and error, which are modulating the streams of information. And so this is what it looks like in your brain. So you can see that's a more simple rendering, but this is an actual shot of the inside of your cortex. And so what's interesting is that, so the thalamus, it's like this organ in the center of your brain that like routes and directs sensory information into where it needs to go. That's one of its main functions. And so that projects right up here into this 5th layer, which will be very significant later on, because there's a high amount of the receptors that psychedelics target there, which is part of the reason why it makes it more likely that you will generate visionary or imaginative experiences. So you can see that, so what happens actually is you get what are called thalamocortical loops developing in different areas of your brain, which is basically a self-sustaining loop between the thalamus extending all the way up to the highest area of the cortex and then back down again. And so that creates basically these little modular kind of, I mean, they're not entirely modular because there's still mechanisms of them laterally interacting. But you get these self-stabilizing, sustaining loops between your thalamus and your cortex. And within those loops is how we sort of entrain our experience to things in the world. And the top of the cortex, the layer that runs all the way at the top, it's usually called the association cortex. And that's because it can interact more widely across different areas than the layers below that. And one of the interesting consequences of that is there is something called the McGurk effect, which I think is precisely a consequence of this architecture. So your visual area is in the back of your head. It's called the occipital lobe, and where your hearing is in your temporal lobes. So they're pretty close. And what happens in the McGurk effect is I hope that I'm getting this correctly. Correct me if I am missing out the order of the phonemes. But, you play somebody the video of somebody saying the phoneme b, and then you play an audio recording of somebody saying g, the letter G. And then what you get is a perceptual experience. People report that they heard the phoneme d or d. And so you're getting miscoordinated perceptions between the visual cortex and the auditory cortex, which are producing a misrepresentation of the phenomena because your expectations of those modalities are interfering in a way such that they produce something that isn't directly coming into the world by that interaction between them. You get sort of a strange interaction that we can see generates information that isn't quite in the world, but is the best inference to the best explanation given the architecture and the predictive modeling based on the probability mechanisms that it's approximating. That's it. Okay, so like I said, this is just an articulation in a simple way of the thalamocortical loops that you develop. So you have the associations running across the top, and then you have these self-stabilizing loops that sort of interact. They develop laterally across the brain, and they predominantly interact across the top. So yeah, just want to make that as clear as possible. Is there anything that anybody would like more information about?
Stay flexible.
Oh, the McGurk effect. And this is how it looks in your vision, basically. So you have this extending all the way from your eyes, which are very fast and automatic. The structure of your eyes pre-selects some information. You only have like 3 cones for color, and so you can't see anything that's not there. And then the processing gets more complex and slow as we ascend up the hierarchy. And at the very top, we have your sort of intention states or your expectation states. What you see a lot of the time is determinate on sort of what you are expecting, sometimes in a very strong sense. So in all of this, where exactly does the experience of perception occur? Do you mind moving on a little bit? Yeah, thanks. Okay, so according to Andy Clark, full-rich percepts take shape only when the downstream predictions match the incoming sensory signal at many levels. So, there's lots of information that's being explained away by your brain, and only when there's a coordination between the top-down and bottom-up are you getting actual experience generating. And so, in other words, the contents of phenomenal experience manifest in the consistent stream of inferences that accord with the generative model. In some way, you can't really see anything that is beyond your capacity to expect or predict in some sense. So, what does that mean about the theories of perception that we have? So, we can see that this is sort of like the common kind account, because perception and hallucination, well, they are basically the same sort of thing. All that you need for either of those things to happen is to get those self-generating thalamocortical loops to kick in, and you get phenomenal experience. And so for the disjunctivist account, which fundamentally states that perception and hallucinations are not the same thing because of missing that causal connectedness to the world, we actually have a little bit of that aspect as well, because the difference is that when you are seeing things in the world, your experiences are entrained by your thalamus and your other subcortical areas, which are keeping things locked into and linked into information that you're getting from the world. So this actually sort of integrates and blends these views together, which is pretty cool. You can see that we're not precisely the most different. We can sort of get rid of the accounts where people want to say, well, when you're seeing hallucinations, you're just getting reflective errors on your experience, but they're not actually happening. I don't think any of those people have ever had a dream in their life. So in waking consciousness, perception is typically stabilized by entrainment to subcortical areas, which are entrained by the sensory apparatus, and thereby to the qualities of the world. There are states where the entrainment is reduced and even eliminated, and this allows the brain to project the generative model absent any stimulus. So in this research, generative model is used as the word to articulate sort of that expectation-driven state which culminates in your experience. And so the generative model usually accords to the world when you are in normal waking consciousness. It's important that that happens. And otherwise, that generative model can become independently generated when, for example, you dream. So that particular quote is taken from this paper here. I highly recommend. It's very good. Carl Friskin, one of the authors, he is the sort of primary articulator of the Bayesian predictive modeling view. He's done a lot of mathematical modeling of that, if you're interested in that scope of the information. And so virtual reality and consciousness inference dreaming, what this basically says is that, well, there is a purpose to dreams. And so when you're in your waking state, your brain can only predict and explain away so much. Otherwise, uncertainty, so to speak, sort of builds up in the system, and then you get false inferences or misinferences sort of finding their way into your experience. And if you stay awake for a few days, you'll probably have some weird hallucinatory phenomena, and that's why, because your brain has to sort of coordinate itself across certain time scales, and if it doesn't do that, then you get a buildup in the bleed-through of information that is typically being explained away. It can't differentiate between what is an error generated by your brain and what isn't. And so when you're dreaming, what is happening in the REM phase of dreaming is that your brain is generating the models that you're using in perception in order to explain away the prediction error that might have culminated over the day. And so it's basically projecting a lot of plausible recombinants of states that allow it to filter out the error and to re-coordinate itself to more optimally coordinate its predictions to your experiences when you wake up the following day. Now, unfortunately, actually I'll switch to this slide first. So basically, the function of dreaming then is model optimization or recalibrating your generative models. And so what's interesting about that is that, that's like completely subpersonal. There's no normative means by which that happens. Your brain isn't trying to model the best case scenario. If it would, that would be great, and a lot of suffering would be relieved. But unfortunately, your brain can also reinforce maladaptive models. So an interesting consequence that comes out of this idea is that you can actually use sleep deprivation to treat depression in some cases. The reason I think that's happening is because if you are following your normal sleep cycles, your brain is just reinforcing a generative model whereby you are worthless and everything isn't worth going on and so on. And so it's an unfortunate consequence of the automatic nature of a lot of this. And so by having somebody stay up for a few days, you actually allow enough uncertainty to build up in the system that they can break out of their normal modeling and sort of incorporate novel information. And yeah, the results, I should have included the citation here, but the results of that are really interesting because if you get somebody to do sleep deprivation for just a short period, you can get alleviations for like a few weeks or months in their experiences of depression. And so, from the brain's point of view, the world is still unfolding with deep hierarchical structure and perceptual content while dreaming. The only thing that's changed is that this content is no longer enslaved by sensory information. And so yeah, like I said, without guidance, REM sleep can reinforce maladaptive models. However, there are ways to introduce higher order monitoring into this model optimization process, which brings us into hybrid states, which feature characteristics of both sleeping and waking consciousness. And so the primary distinction to make here is between primary and secondary consciousness. The defining feature of primary states is elevated entropy, which in these models is effectively equivalent to disorder or uncertainty. I'll give you more specific information about that in a minute. And that, looks like I'll read the information about that now. So, such as the repertoire of functional connectivity motifs that form and fragment across time. So, in the waking state, you have a number of higher order resting state networks, which basically act as like a readiness for you to respond to the world. One of the ones that's been of interest to researchers studying psychedelics is the default mode network. As we'll see, psychedelics happen to sort of dismantle the function of that network And so it basically acts as these patterned heuristics that will bias your response to incoming information and states of the world, because otherwise it's very difficult to sort of account for all things. And the development of that default mode network, interestingly, we can correlate with the development of your personality and your character, because it's completely developmental in nature. That network is learned and instantiates via plasticity in your brain. It's completely absent at birth and then is developing up until you're into your 20s. And so, as I said, entropy within these models is synonymous with high disorder. So there's your normal waking state, there's constrained disorder, there's not a lot of chaotic neural activity. And in secondary consciousness, there is. You have lots of novel connections happening, things are spanning across the brain in weird and spontaneous ways. And so entropy suppression is characteristic of secondary consciousness, which does include metacognitive functions like reality testing and your self-awareness. And it's been proposed that to enter into primary states, you need to collapse normally organized activity within the brain, at least, but perhaps not limited to, the default mode network. And so that leads us to the entropic brain hypothesis, which was proposed by Carhart-Harris and others, and I think Carl Friston actually contributed to this paper as well. For those of you who are interested, Carl Friston, who has done a lot of the mathematical Bayesian modeling in neural brain statistics, has written 1 or 2 papers with Robin Carhart-Harris, who is the principal researcher at the Imperial College in London, who are currently putting out a lot of the primary brain imaging studies with psilocybin and LSD that you've been seeing. So working together, and it has been revealing interesting things about how the brain and consciousness works. So we have the scale here. This is like your normal waking consciousness. It's a little bit constrained, sort of on the bridge into primary consciousness. One of the things about how your brain works generally is that it will snap into states of disorder and then back into states of order. So you have these like phasal switches between synchrony and disorder. So you have a little bit of that chaos happening as you're responding to the novelty of situations in the world. It is a very highly complex place, which you can't possibly predict all of. And so when your brain activity is reduced the most, that brings us into low disorder, very rigid states where you have very minimal activity and not a lot is different between different moments of measurement. From there we get coma, anesthetic, administration, sedation, deep sleep, seizures, depression, OCD, addiction, rigid and narrow thinking generally. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have high disorder and flexible states where there's lots of brain activity happening in a rather disordered way, which features psychedelic state, the infinite consciousness. So, if you ever had the experience of or heard anybody report that, it feels like you're a child again and like everything's new when you're within the psychedelic experience, well, that's true in a very literal sense. And also, characteristic of REM, sleep and dreaming, early psychosis. One of the things that Robin Carhart-Harris and others note in the first study in 2012 they published on psilocybin is that the state initiated by psilocybin seems to be very similar to what you see in the early stages of psychosis, almost identical. So we have some interesting things to explore there, and it sort of brings us back to the 60s and in the research when they were thinking that, well, these could be ways of initiating model psychosis so that we can sort of perhaps gain more empathy with such people or to see how that compares in experimental circumstances. Okay, so this is your brain on drugs. You can see this is the brain in normal waking consciousness, and this is the connectivity under the state of LSD. And so what's an interesting fact about how they work is that, well, I'll go in order here, and then I'll point out what I was going to say that's interesting. So one of the things that they primarily do is to dissolve the integrity of higher order functional connectivity networks. So it seems that psilocybin and LSD, they sort of sit right into the nodes of the default mode network and sort of dissipate that and dissolve that into other networks. And what's pretty cool about that is there's a correlation between the degree of dissolution of that network and your experience of oneness with the world, which makes sense because the default mode network is inversely correlated with past positive networks, which is to say that when your default mode network is active, past positive networks are less active in proportion, and vice versa. So what is making sense of self and world are bleeding into each other. And it also brings the brain closer to a high entropy state, like that of REM dreaming, It increases the overall functional connectivity. However, it also reduces overall blood flow to the brain, but raising it selectively in the right frontal cortex. So overall, you have global reductions in blood flow and activity. So there's less activity, but more connectivity happening at any one given time. However, your right frontal cortex does get a selective increase in activation. Now, this is happening predominantly, but not exclusively, as a mechanism of the 5-HT2A receptors, of which tryptamine psychedelics are an agonist. Yes?
What's the difference between activity and connectivity?
Well, activity is like motion happening in your neurons, and connectivity is like how many are connected at one given time, right? So that could be compared to, this is just an abstraction, so it's like, say your default mode network constrains you to having 20 neurons active at one time, but there are like, so let's say that like 20 neurons are connected, and then there's like 30% of how active they could be happening. Psychedelics will switch that such that you have like 100 neurons connected between that network, but they'll also be, say, 20% active. So it's sort of like they're maintaining a tonic activity. They're not really changing much. They're like maintaining a constant signal across them. That's how that's happening. So the 5-HT2A receptors are serotonin receptors. Serotonin is key to regulating mood and emotion, motivation, sleep, a whole bunch of things. It's a very important neurotransmitter. And you have a lot of them at the top of your cortex along that association area. We also have a bunch of them here in this fifth layer, where, as you'll notice, the thalamus projects up into. So as an agonist, these things will stimulate and increase the activity within the 5-HT2A receptor. So you're getting a shift in the dominance of your processing to generation from your top-down expectation-driven areas. And you're also getting stimulation in the area to which the thalamus is sending sensory information. So it's making it more likely that you will sort of have that sort of section off and differentiate from the information you're taking in from the world, and you'll get sort of a bleed-in of expectation-driven information coming into your actual perceptual experience. So let's talk a little bit about mystical experiences. I'll try to run through this quickly because we don't have too much time. So mystical experiences and personality change. That is fundamentally important because there's evidence that mystical experiences in general can have a transformative effect on personality and well-being. So whether that's initiated by psychedelics, you can look at the Griffiths lab, or any other one, it seems that what is correlative of positive outcome from a psychedelic experience is in fact the occurrence of a mystical experience. And interestingly, bypassing any metaphysical speculation we need to make, regardless of whether or not there is a God, you can have an experience of one. And if they're spontaneous, they generally have the same effect. So there's a book called The Quantum Change, nothing to do with quantum physics. A quantum is like the smallest leap that you could make, which is why that term is used. So it's just to say that like on a dime, you can change your personality via these experiences. And this effect could be attributed, at least in part, to the effect of certain altered states of consciousness interrupting and entrenched construal tendencies at the strictly subpersonal neural level. So, a lot of your processing is automatic and learned, and that can sort of perpetuate states of your being, even if at the level of your individual self, you're like, hey, I don't really want to be doing these things anymore, but why do I keep, acting in ways that perpetuate my own suffering and so on? Well, that's how that works, and that's pretty much identical to the Buddhist notion of samsara, for example. You get stuck in these wheels of self-reinforcing suffering. Of course, you can do that in ways that are positive for you, but life is suffering, so that's the default. Now, the content of visionary experiences, however, and the interactions with this content is relevant to the outcome of the experience overall. So I'll just quickly break down two kinds of experience that we have. We have the unitive experience. This is the ecstasy of St. Teresa, where you have sort of feelings of oneness with the world. You feel no boundary between self and other. There's ecstatic bliss. So it's mostly emotional and an altered experience of self. Then we have the visionary experience. So this is the Four Horsemen of Revelation. And in visionary experience, you're actually seeing content. So there's a few different ways that you could be doing this. You can have imaginative visions, which you're very aware are happening all in your head, or you can have visions of an angel or Christ standing before you or something of the sort. And then the researcher that I draw on this for a lot is, weirdly, a lot of psychologists just completely ignore this domain of experience. His name is Dan Merker, if you want a good citation. His book, Gnosis, Gnosis, is amazing. And Yeah, so he also counts sort of, say, ecstatic bouts of writing. So long as you're generating content and you're, say, experiencing the channeling of content or the experience of content, that is the defining feature of visionary experiences. So let's look at the Walter Pahnke Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which was developed for the Good Friday experiment and is still used to this day, but is completely inadequate in not being able to differentiate those two categories of experience. So these are the features: internal unity, external unity, transcendence of time and space, connectability. Words can't describe what you're experiencing, sense of sacredness, noetic quality, that you encountered alternate reality, and so on, and deeply felt and positive mood. There's a number of problems that I have with that. One of them is that for deeply felt and positive mood, well, there's no good reason to say that just because your experience is terrifying, it's not mystical, right? If you've ever heard any reports of people doing ayahuasca, very often they're very unpleasant, and yet people continue to go back to them, and in fact gain a lot out of them. So that's just wrong. And there's nothing about this that makes reference to content. And I'll give you some self-reports to show you that this doesn't really capture what's going on within the psychedelic psychotherapy treatments. And what's really cool is you actually, in order to make sense of this, you can make reference to the entire history of religion. So the Walter Pahnke Mystical Experience Questionnaire was developed for something that's fundamentally Christian. Christianity very early on sort of tried to get rid of the imagination. Effectively, that's like some weird pagan stuff that you don't want to go into. And if you look at Protestant churches and so on, they're all very plain and there's really no images because idol worship and so on. And so any rendering of the imagination was seen like demons and devils and so on. However, there are exceptions within that. But for example, if you look at Vajrayana Buddhism, you try to, one of the key practices is to try to generate an perceptual image of one or another deity and then to become it so that you can channel its effect into the world. So there's very distinct differences between how mystical experiences came to be understood in the West and the East, and I can talk about that a bunch, but unfortunately I don't have time. So let's read some self-reports to see how that bears on how we are doing our research. So I use this report because it happens with MDMA, which is typically understood as a feeling or emotional substance, but let's see what happens to this individual whose name is Nick. Nick was in one of the treatments funded by MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He was a veteran and developed PTSD after being on active duty. So now with the MDMA fully engaged, this visualized world seemed real, present, beyond conscious control. He explored the dark space until he came to a door, but it was guarded by an old man with a long white beard. Like a sage, Nick thought, a wise man. The sage opened the door and led Nick to the stone wall's ledge. They descended to the spiral stairs together, but the fire at the bottom had burned out. Nick followed the old man to the second door. The old man gestured at the door and Nick opened it. Inside, the chain was lying on the ground. The dragon was gone. Okay, well that's a lot going on. There's really nothing unique about that at all. And look, so the dragon was gone. So this is like the second or third time he's been here. He encountered a dragon previously. And the fire, which had previously been active, was burned out. So there's a number of meaningful changes within the experiences that he's having. So it's not even just the fact of having experiences themselves, but you actually interact with them and experience symbolic transformation within these visionary landscapes, and that is crucial to the healing. For interacting with his landscape is what brought Nick to the insights that led to his experience of healing.
Yeah, is this, the MDMA tests are also done with the blindfold, doing an internal experience, so it's like a dream state that he's talking about rather than like the actual vision?
Yep. Yeah. All right, so let's read this one. I like this and I love the picture, it just is so perfect. There were rays of psychedelic yellow light coming from the face of the reassuring entity. She was trying to communicate with me. She seemed very concerned for me. There was something outlined in green right in front of me. She was showing me how to use this thing, perhaps how to get swifty. It resembled a computer terminal. I believe she wanted me to try to communicate with her through this device. So that's from the spirit molecule. It's the experience of DMT, and probably you're all familiar with the fact that DMT is particularly visionary and visual, and there's a lot going on there. What's important that I like about this quote is that, so this entity is trying to get this individual to interact with it. They can't figure it out. Now that's not to say that that's where the experience ends, but perhaps if he had figured it out, something else would have happened. So interaction with these experiences is also important. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we can't lead people through these experiences in an effective way. So, All right, I'm going to try to give you a summary of prophecy in like 5 minutes. So this book was rather inspirational to me. I wrote this last year and then wrote a number of papers in like Kabbalah and prophecy and revelation and so on. And so Rick Strassman, who was the person doing the experiments with DMT in the 90s for the spirit molecule, he says that, like I mentioned earlier, there's a bit of a bias in how we're understanding mystical experiences. We're using, say, models of Theravada or Zen Buddhism and later Christianity. But as we've seen, that doesn't really capture what's going on within these experiences. So he proposes that prophecy is in fact a better model for what's going on in the psychedelic experience. Now, there's a book from 1190 called The Guide for the Perplexed. It was developed by a person named Moses Maimonides, and so the philosopher's view of prophecy is that it's a natural faculty of humans. Although the faculty is common to the whole race, it's not fully developed in each individual, either on account of the individual's defective constitution or on some external cause. So there we go. We have a natural faculty, which is the predictive processing mechanisms of your brain, which will independently generate experience. Boom. And he also adds the fact within sort of the religious theologian's view that another thing is that God can actively prevent you from having prophecy. Just so you know, that was his view, but otherwise it accords perfectly with the view of the philosophers. So basically, prophetic revelation and visionary experience is just an advanced form of thought natural to people based on the mechanisms of your brain. All prophetic images are the figurative representation of intelligible ideas and concepts. They're like visual metaphors, rich in meaning and capable of being interacted with. There's some things that you can't really verbalize or render in language, and so your brain also presents them to you in images. And so here we have John of Patmos writing the book of Revelation. He's having this internal imaginative experience of the beast of Revelation and these angels that are getting the messages and frantically writing it down. So there's lots and lots of reference for these kinds of experiences. They are kept alive in what is called the occult today. Unfortunately, given the history of how religion has played out, these sort of experiences have been delegated to, for example, like Thelema, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and all of these other things. They're still doing it. We also have theurgy, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah. Kabbalah is interesting. It has like so many variants. There's some where you just like literally visualize language. It's very cool. Hermeticism, alchemy, tantra, Vajrayana Buddhism, as I mentioned before, shamanism, and of course Carl Jung tried to bring it back with, for example, his practice of active imagination. And so the advantages of visionary mystical experiences are that as experience is fundamentally intertwined with the processes that generate it, experience modulates those processes just as those processes modulate experience. So it's appropriating and making use of the mechanisms in both perception and in dreaming, where you can interact with and coordinate your neural models by generating virtual environments and interacting with them. And lucid dreaming, the psychedelic state, and other methods of inducing vivid and interactive mental imagery could present domains of functioning that provide unique access to shaping the generative models involved in perception and construal by shaping and interacting with virtual environments for coordinating neural substrate too. So an implication that this has for how we're doing treatments in psychedelic therapy is instead of doing like talk therapy, before we're doing psychedelic therapy sessions, we could also be training people in Carl Jung's technique of active imagination, which is basically you just hold an image in your mind and then try to make it as clear as possible, and then once the image starts to make movements of its own, you sort of let it flow and sort of see what comes to you. This takes some practice, and it's very difficult for a lot of people, but you can have very complicated sort of internal journeys by doing that. And so I think we could reasonably construct an experiment, which probably have to be worked on, but you could do one group of people who are doing active imagination, one group of people who are doing traditional talk therapy, check their self-reports, seeing if any more of them are getting visionary types of experiences, and also see if that has any relationship to the outcomes from these therapies. Perhaps we can increase the efficacy. I think that if you are getting content and meaningful answers that you can act upon, that might be more useful than just having experiences of contentless bliss. It's very difficult to act on nothingness. So, at the end of the day, what this means is that to see through the veils of your own perceptions, sometimes you need to see some things. And that is it for my talk. So there's like 15 minutes to the next one. I'll take questions for 5 minutes and then we'll have to get going. I saw your hand first.
I would just like to know,
the artist who did that drawing at the end there?
Oh, and I think that's Giordano Bruno.
Who is it?
Giordano Bruno.
Okay. I'll have to get your name from him like after.
Yeah,
or name,
sure.
His name after.
Yeah, he was burned at the stake for claiming that the universe was infinite and that the stars are in fact.
Before.
Yes. Very common. I'm pretty sure that's who it is. Yeah, feel free to get in touch after.
Yeah, I'll put it down.
What's the picture a couple slides before the visionary experiences? To this one, yeah.
Oh, that's William Blake. William Blake's amazing.
That's Satan, right? Or is that?
No, that's a dragon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. He has like his own mythology. The character that correlates with Satan, I think it's Orc. Its name is Orc. It's not this creature.
He did not create illustrations for Dante's Inferno?
He didn't.
No, that's
And
All right. Yeah, it's similar to a lot of experience. Yeah,
so for those of you who heard your question was to expand on lucid dreaming. So lucid dreaming is like, please be respectful of the people who want to hear thank you. So the primary difference is that like lucid dreaming is where introducing consciousness, waking consciousness into a sleeping dreaming state, whereas psychedelic state like sleeping dreaming consciousness and waking state. And you know, lucid dreaming is like it's really difficult to probably expand on methods or techniques or something. One of the methods is that there's two. There's like the wake back to bed method where you like wake yourself up like at some point and try to go back to sleep. But usually like the technique of mindfulness. So it's like while you're back to sleep, you maintain mindfulness meditation. Eventually you will find that you persist in your experience even though your body will start to fall asleep. So it's sort of like maintaining your mind conscious as your body is Yeah, that's a good memory. Yes.
You had two columns with like more of the minus states in the United States, and one of the things in the were like magic thinking.
Yeah, that's a term that's used in like. So that's like to say perhaps that, oh, the whole universe is conspiring about me, or like I am influencing something in the distance of my mind. It's like that's the psychological definition of it. So it's like, you've experienced that? Yeah. Yeah. So it's like a weird reality testing thing within the psychological literature. It's completely an incorrect way of seeing it. It's like metacognitive error and so on. But yeah, that's what it is. It's basically just perceiving causation as though it's magically happening rather than like physically happening.
And are those that just 1 to 9, is that like an order, the spectrum, or is it just like all of them?
Yeah, it's a non-ordered list.
So in terms of like Vajrayana practitioners, the arrow normally being conscious, like is there mental states more towards the higher entity?
Yeah, I mean I should also clarify that high entropy doesn't mean good by any means, you know.
I'm just wondering because like they do a lot of studies on Vajrayana practitioners and higher mental states, and I'm wondering if
So one of the key things is that, you know, you might still be within that boundary of normal waking consciousness, but there would be less inhibitory mechanisms preventing you from breaking into novel states that you need to get into. So you're basically training your brain to mitigate the influence of inhibition on breaking into novel states of consciousness, rather than having a persistent or permanent different one.
Like, how does the generative model kind of like line up with like Jung's primary process or like tantric energy winds?
I don't know. I haven't looked into either of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. But when
Oh, sorry.
but when you say kind of like entropy kind of like gets stored in, like, inside you and then it like comes out in your dreams.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like your brain basically becomes miscoordinated. So it starts improperly filtering out some information. and just doing a bad job.
Okay, when you kind of like get more tired and like
Yeah,
your
yeah.
cell just kind of goes down.
Saying it stores uncertainty is sort of a weird way to talk about it. It's basically that there's a lot that's happening that's actually knocking your predictive mechanisms off kilter a little bit,
Okay.
but your brain has the capacity to sort of filter those out mostly, and as it becomes sort of knocked off kilter by the intrinsically uncertain environment, like, it just is the case that there's a lot that's going on around you that
Yeah.
you're filtering out regularly. An interesting consequence of that is that, maybe these psychedelics are helping you to see things that are actually in the environment beyond you, although there's really no good way of like differentiating that, because it's like minimizing what's called sensory gating, the filtering out of information from the world. And so, yeah, it's more rather than storing the entropy, sort of knocking the predictive mechanisms off kilter.
Okay, cool.
So you mentioned in the lecture that in Christianity, or specifically Protestantism, that they're very anti-imagination, anti-visionary in a sense, right? How do you feel about the Catholic Church being more, and it's a personal question, but there's many visions that happen in the Catholic Church,
Yeah.
or experiences of visions of apparitions of Mother Mary to individuals that are widely accepted in the Catholic Church. Some
Yeah.
aren't, some are.
That is a result of the, what's the word? I don't want to use the moral implication of this word, but basically, like the paganism that Christianity wanted to get rid of never went away. It sort of infected it and sort of came out from within. And so, if you look at how Christianity wanted, yeah, basically. Yeah, it's like the ergot fungus, right? It grows within barley, and then it's hidden within it, and it has the guise of the barley plant, but it is actually something that isn't fundamentally Christianity. So, and even these experiences of like statues crying and so on, that is like completely antithetical to how Christianity started out, which was basically by smashing the idols of pagans that did that.
Well, some of them they smashed, some of them they reinterpreted.
Yeah. Italian Christianity, which became the Roman Catholic Church, predominantly maintained a lot of its pagan roots. So that's where you get a lot of that sort of reincorporation of those.
I should say also though that in German Catholic churches and in German areas that are Catholic and Protestant, even some of them, they maintain a lot of the idols and like visions and visionary aspects of their religion.
Yeah. Oh yes. Now more of that. There's a key distinction to be made as well with like Gnosticism, which is really Christianity, and that is much more heavily like magical and visionary.
It was connecting early philosophers, Greek Roman philosophy to Christian Catholic philosophy. Right?
Yeah. Well, Christianity grew out of the Greek tradition as well, so it's sort of a continuation of that. And Valerie, I saw another question.
There's time. The first one was on one of your slides. You were saying that with the psychedelics, your brain is overall higher in connectivity, but it's also more higher in entropy. And as far as I understand brain, like when it's higher in connectivity, it means everything's like correlated and doing the same thing. So how can it also be like doing more different things than higher in
So it's like I said in all those states. So you have like cross-network activity happening. So it's like it is the fact that when there is connection, usually that it is within determined networks that are happening nearby, it is correlated to the activity in other aspects of the network. But it's actually specifically a dissolution of those networks. So you're having like internetwork activity, you're having patterns connecting that would not otherwise be connected. So.
And second one, do you think there's like a role for both the visionary experiences and the non-contextual ones, and how would they relate, or what are the different roles?
Yeah, so for example, within Kabbalah and other things, you have these experiences where you have to ascend to the seven heavens and like present angels and passwords and so on. And once you get to the eighth layer of heaven, you have transcendental ecstatic bliss. So visionary experiences are often a means by which you get to the unitive experience. What I think is most important is that you need to have that ability to render, say, the will of God, or you refer to that as, into intelligible terms. So having an imagination is very important because you're just having those contactless experiences of bliss without the capacity to render them into imaginative language and bring them to other people. They're not quite as useful. So I think it's important to couple them because historically, visionary experiences are a means by which you get to unitive experiences, and so just talking about unitive experiences is like jumping to the end of the chain prematurely, but also it helps you to sort of articulate those experiences to people around you and thereby make them more productive, not only you, but the community.
I also imagine like if it was a vision telling you something something you should do in your life, like that'd be more concrete direction.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, if you look at,
So you're bringing yourself back to.
yeah, if you look at like Ibogaine and like ayahuasca experiences, usually like an entity is like, hey, you do this or you're gonna suck for the rest of your life. And people take that seriously, you know, it's like they give you direct, explicit instruction. So, and yes, that's much more easy to act on than nothing. Yes. Okay, I have to wrap it up there. We're gonna switch to the next talk, so thank you everybody.